such an argument could be made.
You mean what was meant by these words? Is that the question? If it wasn't, if they're not to be taken at the foot of the letter, so to speak.
Get it into the same mode of speech as they tore us to shreds.
You mean right? When they tore us to shreds meant they beat us badly. Well, I mean, the person that suggested this way of looking at the matter said what it probably really meant was something like attack them, defeat them, drive them out, not literally kill every man, woman, child, donkey, and the like.
The question is how do you, that's a plausible sounding reading, but how do you get there and support it that rather than the literal reading is the...
Well, this is... Yeah, this would, I mean, this goes well outside my area of expertise. This Old Testament scholars look at how these terms, as far as they can make out, and allied terms in other cultures, how they did in fact function to the best of their ability to find out. It's always a bit, I suspect, dicey to determine anything as quite as specific as that, but they seem to have their reasons. And all I was saying is, well, maybe that's one possibility. Okay. Right. It does leave open the question, you might go on then to ask, well, was it just of God to tell the Israelites to drive these people out, to dispossess them and the like, to war against them? Well, that's another question, but it's not quite the same one.
Okay. If I might just add a footnote to that, I mean, that might be right. I don't find it possible to read the text that way, but I'm not an Old Testament scholar. If God had the option of just saying, go do battle with those people and defeat them, as opposed to this more florid rhetoric, knowing what he must have known about how that more aggressive rhetoric would strike the ears of people hundreds of years down the line, then I don't know why he wouldn't have just said more exactly what he meant.
This question is for Dr. Fales. Near the end of your paper, you put forward a sociological explanation for Scripture, and it's easy to understand how this would work, say in the case of the Israelites believing that God gave them the land and told them to kill their enemies and was fighting for them. But then you say, quote, the sociological approach makes it possible to explain how Jesus could have sensibly preached both love of enemies and hatred of one's family. Could you say a little bit more about how a sociological explanation could explain the appeal of Jesus' words about this? Because that seems much less intuitive to me.
I'm tempted to respond by saying no. Just because it's hard to say just a little and really make any sort of a case that's reasonably plausible. Let me say this, which is cryptic at best. But I want to say something that's perhaps not too controversial. It does seem that fairly early on, at least by the time of Paul, Christianity was a movement that was intent upon speaking to the Gentiles. And of course, in this context, the Gentiles, above all, would mean the people of the Roman Empire. And to do that required them to think beyond the boundaries of Israel, which was, after all, fundamentally, at least in its ideology, if not in fact at the time, a tribal society. Any anthropologist can tell you that, by definition, really, a tribal society is one in which social relationships and responsibilities and all kinds of other things are predicated on kinship relations. I actually understand this saying, which is attributed to Jesus, whether he said it or Whether this got invented after Paul's time, I don't know. I actually read that as an indictment of a tribal way of thinking about things. So I don't happen to read it as a commandment the Greek word is misein, which really must be translated hate, but I don't think the injunction is to feel hate in the emotional sense. It is to challenge the very foundations of tribal organization. Now, I mean, obviously a whole lot more would have to be said in order to even begin to make some sense of that, but I hope that's enough.
The question part is refers to your discussion of the book of Job, because in discussing Job, you say that what Job comes to see at the end is that God, being God, must indeed have a good reason for having done what he did. And it seemed to me that if you accept a robust version of divine command theory, God doesn't need to have a good reason to do anything he does. Anything he does becomes valid simply in virtue of his having chosen to do it. And wouldn't that make it easier for you to deal with the actual text of Job and first of all, the reason that's given for inflicting the sufferings on Job, which Evan mentioned, that is to say he wants to prove to Satan that Job is worshiping him without any hope of nice treatment. And also the passage in chapter 2 of Job where Job says to Satan that he's inflicting suffering on Job without any good reason.
Let me take your questions in reverse order. I'm not sure just how many there were in there, but I noticed at least two. So one was about the reasons given for Job's being afflicted in the way he was. I don't take it, this is like a parable. So it's not obvious that you're to take the first part of this parable. God and Job are having this God and Satan are having this conversation back and forth and so on. Not to take that as what's being taught. I should think that would be much more like some of the details of some of Jesus's parables. It's not, the suggestion is God, what's being taught, I think there is, that God has a reason for afflicting Job, and later on, Job never finds out what that reason is, but he does get a vision of what God is really like in that last confrontation with God. And once he sees what God is really like, knows what God is really like, then he knows that God must have a good reason. Now, your second question, you say, well, if a divine command theory is true, isn't it the case that God doesn't need a good reason? Can't he just do whatever he wants? And the answer is he can do whatever he wants, and whatever he wants, given his nature, will in fact be good. That is, good such that if we take our own moral intuitions and imagine them purified and extended and so on, we would see them to be good. They would correspond with our own moral intuitions. And so the sense in which Job knows that God does have a good reason is Job knows this: God has what I, Job, would take to be a good reason. I would regard that as a good reason.
Okay, there was someone over there by the camera. Yeah.
Like Professor Stump, I have a comment and a question. I'll try to be brief with both. The comment is that it seems to me that if Professor Fales' argument is pretty much that if you pick up the Bible and you're trying to take as an approach to the faith for the first time, then it's going to fail to do that. I mean, the God in there is not worthy of worship. And it seems to me that if that's one way of approaching the gist of the argument, then the responses that Professor Plantinga gave, alluding to, well, we have to just understand God's ways are not our ways, the title of this conference, do seem to be inadequate because they're presupposing already believing in this God and then justifying that belief. And I think in that sense, then, we need to keep in mind that most Christians and other religious believers approach God not by coming to the naked scriptures, but through the personal encounter with God. And so it's that encounter that justifies the faith, and then they work through the philosophical theodicies and so on in the light of the various challenges that interpreting Scripture presents. The sense of, again, faith first, then seeking the understanding. And then my question, which is directed to Professor Plantinga, is you alluded to how our moral intuitions have shifted between the past and the present. Of course, that's right. My question is, what do you think there's actually been an evolution, a moral evolution, that our intuitions today are actually better than, and as we continue, we're sort of approaching this infinite limit, where as we continue, our intuitions will actually get closer to God's understanding. That the more and more we develop our own understanding of what the good is, the closer and closer we'll come to the way God conceives of and commands the good. And if that's true, then I think that it licenses more creative hermeneutics when we approach Scripture, written several thousand years ago.